Does coffee make you anxious, sweaty, unfocused, or maybe your doctor thinks you have a crippling caffeine addiction, which I am definitely not in any way referencing for my personal life? Let me turn you on to Mantra Matcha. Mantra Matcha is ceremonial-grade matcha from a private hillside in Uji, Japan. Smooth, naturally sweet, and it gives you this calm, focused energy without the jitters. It's packed with antioxidants like more than 130 times more than regular green tea, so you feel energized and you feel good. Now, the matcha flavor isn't for everybody, but good news, Mantra has 6 infused flavors like banana cacao, strawberry lemon, cinnamon goji berry, and rosehip dragon fruit, which sounds like a name from Game of Thrones, but it's delicious. Plus, every box you buy helps provide a meal to a child through the No Kid Hungry program, which we love. Now, right now, listeners to Make It Make Sense can go to mantramatcha.com and use the code MIMS25 for 15% off. Now, that code also supports Make It Make Sense with a commission. That's how these things work. I got to legally tell you. But the good news is you'll help the show, you'll stay caffeinated, and maybe not too much. Again, that code at mantramatcha.com is MIMS25 for 15% off. Mantra Matcha, less chaos, more clarity, 2 things we could all use a little bit of right now. All right, let's get on with the show. It's Friday, February 13th, 2026. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Herms. Today on the show, something a little bit different. I know I've been saying that lately with some of these episodes, but this one truly is, because what we're talking about today is what's happening around the world. Make It Make Sense generally just does domestic politics stuff, or we take what's happening around the world through the lens of how it affects us here at home. But sometimes, to make things make sense, you have to look outside of our own borders. And that's why my guest today is Eric Czuleger. Eric has lived a million different lives. He was an aid worker. He spent a lot of his time mostly overseas. He was a journalist for a little while. He's the author of the book, You Are Not Here, all about living in countries that aren't actually recognized countries. And he's the author of the brand new newsletter, The Under Report, and the new podcast by the same name, which you'll hear me say this in the episode, but the first episode of The Under Report dropped earlier this week, and I was absolutely riveted. It is definitely a part of my weekly rotation now, and Eric and I talk a lot about what's happening around the world and why it's happening in places like Iran or Venezuela, or what's happening with Greenland, and this idea of strategic abandonment by the United States from our allies and people we used to call our allies, and what that means for us and the rest of the world. It's part intelligence gathering, it's part history lesson, it's part foreign policy discussion, and admittedly, sometimes we nerd out a little bit, but Eric is the guy to do this with because he is just so good at it. Before we get to the conversation, make sure you're following or subscribed to the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. Leave a review or a comment. It really helps boost the show. Sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack, where this week I am launching a brand new newsletter on Sunday called Make It Make Nonsense, where you're going to get all the stuff that I'm thinking about this week that has nothing to do with politics. It's a little bit of fun. It's what's been keeping me sane, and hopefully it'll help keep you a little more sane as well. That will be just for paid subscribers and drops on Sunday. All right, let's get to my conversation with Eric Czuleger. Eric, thank you so much for being here. I'm really, really excited to talk to you.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So before we get into what's happening around the world, I want you to talk about who you are, what your background is a little bit here. Talk about the podcast, which listeners, there will be a link to this in the show notes because it's now going to be a part of my weekly listening because it was so good this first episode. But Eric, let's pump you up a little bit here.
Sure. My name is Eric Czuleger. I have had a career that has taken me through quite a few different jobs and around the world to over 47 different countries at the moment and counting. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Northern Albania from 2011 to 2013, and then ended up working as a journalist and being trained as an intelligence analyst for a private company operating in Texas. And after years of studying conflict and also working in the aid realm as well, I realized that I wanted to do more immersive work, and I decided to go and spend a year and a half of my life living in only unrecognized countries to write a book about it. So I lived in Iraqi Kurdistan, Kosovo, Transnistria, Liberland, if you've heard of that one, and Somaliland, which is the autonomous portion of northern Somalia. And I did that to write a book about it. So I wrote my book, You Are Not Here, Travels Through Countries That Don't Exist. It's out now. And since then, I decided I wanted to go back and see where a lot of the policy decisions that I saw being made on the ground in these permissive and non-permissive locations, like where these ideas came from in the first place. And so that led me to go back into school and getting a master's degree at the Rand School of Public Policy, where I studied national security. And I had a focus on psychological operations and media manipulation. So specifically, I just really wanted to look at, why we are led to believe the things that we're led to believe and how we can defend our information space, specifically as Americans, where we have an enormously open information space. And the sort of double-edged sword of being able to speak to the world, but also having the entire world be able to speak to us and potentially destabilize our country.
Let's start with Iran. The president has had quite a bit of focus on Iran. There have been talks about moving certain military assets, whether it's ships or planes or drones, over into near Iranian airspace. There was new photos of what looks like Iran is rebuilding its nuclear program after we supposedly decimated it over the summer. What's your take on what's happening with Iran right now?
So with Iran right now, we are seeing some double talk about what the effectiveness of Operation Midnight Hammer actually was. The messaging in the very beginning of the, I suppose the very end of the 12th Day War was that their nuclear program was absolutely decimated, and that essentially the nuclear threat from Iran was entirely gone. And that would achieve the major strategic goals of not only the United States, but also Israel and quite a few other regional actors like Saudi Arabia and Qatar. However, due to the fact that we're seeing reoccurring talks about the nuclear program, clearly that was not the case. So we are right now seeing a couple of things happening. One, we've seen the carrier strike group move into the Persian Gulf, and currently another set of I don't think it's a carrier strike group, but another set of boats are moving into the Persian Gulf to have the sort of additional firepower, but also that equates to additional bargaining power.
Right.
And at the same time, Iran and the United States are engaged in talks about the nuclear program in Oman. There were a couple of interesting bits that happened in the lead up to the current talks in Oman. First, the United States stated that they wanted the talks moved to Turkey, which is certainly more in the backyard of the U.S. There are U.S. bases in Turkey. Turkey is a NATO member. And secondly, the U.S. didn't want to constrain the talks to only the nuclear program. In fact, they wanted to expand that into the missile program that Iran has. Now, if you've read much about Iranian missile cities, or your viewers have, it's in the name. It's the city of missiles. They got a lot of them, and they're pretty remarkable for defense and deterrence from the Iranian perspective. And this is because Iran is basically a fortress of mountains. And even though they are sort of in a weakened state right now, they are still more than able to punch above their weight class by launching missiles from inside the cover of those mountains.
Right.
So it seems that the U.S. has actually walked back what their demands were. They decided to meet in Oman, which is certainly more in Iran's neighborhood. And they also said, okay, we're going to have these talks just around the nuclear program. Meanwhile, we have an enormous amount of material that is in the neighborhood, let's say, So there's a good deal of tension that's built up in the region. That's all backgrounded by the fact that there are ongoing political movements and riots in the entire country of Iran at this point. So something needs to happen here. And the question really is, from an analytical point of view, what can happen?
Yeah.
And I see a couple of different possibilities for this. Obviously, the United States and Israel would like to see, and also some other regional actors as well, would like to see a regime change from the Islamic Republic to something that is, let's say, more friendly and open to Western interests. The Islamic Republic likely feels the opposite of that.
Right.
So, but at the same time, their power is incumbent upon them being able to maintain this threat of future nuclear deterrence. I was talking with a colleague about Iran the other day, and they mentioned that they were looking at an Iranian bill, a piece of Iranian currency, and they noticed that there was a watermark that had the nuclear symbol on it. So when you hold it up to the light, you see the watermark through it, and I mean that really tells you where in the sort of Islamic Republic strategic goals nuclear power really sits. And they're in a really difficult spot strategically because they don't have a demonstrable nuclear weapon. They are in the phase where if they were to get a demonstrable nuclear weapon, then they would be able to have a great deal more bargaining power. Right now, their sort of version of the nuclear weapon is their ability to sort of strangle the Strait of Hormuz, which is an energy corridor through which an enormous amount of not only energy travels through. This on the Red Sea. But an astounding amount of goods also travel through this.
It's a major trading route in the Middle East, and one that the United States attempted to defend earlier this year and frequently does defend. It's one of the major shipping lanes of the planet.
And the Iran has been able to project power through this area pretty well. And it's not just through violent force, but it's through cost imposition. So the Houthi rebels are supported by Iran. They're also trained by Iran. The missiles that they are firing are provided by Iran. But essentially, you have a missile that is being fired or a drone that is being flown by these rebels in this area, which can almost bring global shipping and global energy to a halt, at least in that area. And the cost is relatively low, but the cost for the United States to respond to that is enormously high. So when you have, a couple $100,000 of rockets that are able to force the United States to spend a couple million, if not a couple $1 billion worth of material and cost, then suddenly you have an enormous cost imposition on the U.S.
Sure.
So not only are you achieving this strategic goal of saying, hey, look, I have a good deal of power, not only regionally, but globally, but I'm also making my adversaries spend a lot of their time and a lot of cognitive abilities to suppress a threat, which potentially isn't central to their strategic goals.
Right. And it's not just those two things you just mentioned too, but it's also actual money. It's the deployment of military assets. It is paying analysts and intelligence officers to do their jobs, and the potential for businesses to reroute outside of the Strait of Hormuz and those kind of things too, which is expensive and difficult to do. One of the things good.
Well, I think one of the things that people fail to realize domestically is that the U.S. military, even though it may seem as if it can be everywhere all at once all the time, which frankly the U.S. military does a pretty darn good job at, it is still a bit of a zero-sum game. Every time you move a carrier strike group from one location, then it is not in that location. It is in another location. So we have pivoted our resources from the South China Sea in this case to the Persian Gulf. In the case of the Caribbean, we have moved our carrier strike group. I can't remember which president that one's named after. But it's currently around 25% of the boats in the Navy. 25% of the boats in the U.S. Navy, let that sink in, are in the Caribbean. This is the largest deployment of naval assets since, I believe, the Bay of Pigs. And because of that, we do not have assets that are currently on within striking distance of the Mediterranean. We have some assets that are off the coast of Nigeria, we have some assets that are off the coast of Africa, which have been used in Nigeria specifically to suppress the Islamic State elements there. But what you can see from this outset of resources is a story that the United States is starting to tell about its foreign policy priorities.
Let's talk about that story then. I mean, I do want to go back and talk about Iran and some of the spillover we're seeing, but tell me about this story that you're seeing start to unfold here.
Yeah, well, I think the Iran absolutely factors into this story for the foreign policy of the current administration in the United States. And so part of the story that's being told here is a pivot back towards the homeland. Now, to understand kind of where this story starts coming from, we have to go all the way back to the Bretton Woods agreement. This was the agreement where post World War II, essentially Europe is decimated. The major manufacturing sector of the world and the major economic power of the world is essentially just not there anymore. Either it's not functioning, it's completely destroyed, or the individuals that used to run it have fled mostly to America. But also the shipping apparatus of the world is not intact anymore. And so the United States started to be able to project power across both the Pacific and Atlantic at the same time. And the deal of Bretton Woods was essentially, hey, we will help you rebuild your economy so long as you do it in a friendly way to the US dollar. We will help you to rebuild your security apparatus so long as you do it in a friendly way to the United States. And we will be the sort of global guarantor of shipping so that we can end some of these regional conflicts over colonization or trade routes or any of the resource collection that was pretty common in World War I and World War II.
Right.
And so that world order worked really, really well, especially for the United States, for the last 80 years or so.
Right. It's sometimes called the Pax Americana, right? It's sometimes called the American peace post-World War II. It's kind of what led to this being the safest time to be alive as a human in human history. Absolutely.
That's exactly right. And I think that it is very difficult for people to step outside and look at how much development has happened within the last 80 years, how relatively peaceful the world has been. But that's also because, our generation hasn't experienced global war fighting or great power conflict the way that previous generations have. But the problem with the Bretton Woods Accords was that they started to fray at the edges. Essentially, you have ascendant powers in China, in Russia, and because of this, the security apparatus started to be pushed against by people who want a bigger part of the pie. Russia had been retrenching and rebuilding its military. Meanwhile, Europe was under the overwatch of the United States and didn't have the powerful incentive to rebuild a robust and interoperable military because NATO was presumably always going to be there.
Right.
Then the global war on terror happened. And when the global war on terror happened, initially it was a coalition of the willing, but it started to show the cracks between NATO countries. it's starting to show that this was not a unified and galvanized front against all threats, and that it could be picked apart. Russia sees this, of course, and begins to try and find out where the cracks exist between this alliance. And so at a certain point, the United States has been trying to get Europe, get NATO to, throw in so it's been trying to get Europe and NATO to join in the security relationship in terms of their financing, in terms of training, in terms of interoperability. But eventually, the dollars didn't make sense. And the U.S. is starting to look more towards its own backyard and say, look, I will start looking out for number one, right? And number one is protecting the homeland and essentially saying that so long as I can protect my supply lines over here in my neck of the woods in the Western Hemisphere, then I'm good. Good luck, Europe. But there are some huge negative externalities that fall out of this.
Yeah, and I was just thinking, like, that does get us to the list of demands the president has when it comes to Greenland, the threats he's made to Cuba and Mexico and Colombia and several other, Latin American and Caribbean countries here, is that by turning inward, and we can talk about what you're seeing in the story that the United States is telling in the Caribbean and South America, but in turning inward, what are we losing when it comes to our relationship with Europe and, keeping influence that we'd rather not have, take hold in, let's say, the Middle East, let's say Iran, taking hold? What do we risk by doing what we're doing right now?
Yeah, I think that's a really such a wide-ranging question here. All right, let's actually start with Greenland, because I think that Greenland is a fantastic case study in how the U.S. has started to pivot its foreign policy and what it is willing to do in terms of sacrificing its traditional structure of alliances. So the whole diplomatic row over Greenland it's kind of the perfect example of what I'm calling a strategic abandonment, right? So or at least threatening to strategically abandon Europe. You have an actual symbolic deployment of I think there were German and Danish and French soldiers onto the island of Greenland as an actual show of force against a NATO member. What this tells us is two things. One, the United States is remarkably serious about protecting the Western Hemisphere, and that it takes a very broad definition of what exactly the Western Hemisphere is. Now, previously in the Monroe Doctrine, the focus of Western Hemispheric defense was really South America, and that's all. But now, as Arctic defense becomes much more important, and this is due to climate change and also Russian and Chinese aggression in the Arctic region, we are, let's say, drawing the loop a little bit wider and saying, hey, Greenland is also important to U.S. national security. But the thing about Greenland is that it was clearly so important that we were willing to threaten our previous allies and hopefully current allies. So this is a big part of the story of American foreign policy under Trump, right? It is saying that everybody in a certain respect is an adversary. It doesn't matter if we have worked together before, but essentially we are going to try to renegotiate so that your margins are absolutely razor thin in our relationship. And this is simply transactional. So long as what, from their perspective, American national security is protected. And for the Trump administration, this really does mean a return to this hemispheric defense model. But might feel good in the short term if we're able to actually shore up security in the Western Hemisphere. But one of the biggest things that we risk is one of America's greatest advantages, and that is our enormous network of alliances.
Mm-hmm.
There is no country in the world that has as robust a framework of mutual defense alliances as the United States, bar none. It simply does not exist. And I think that one of the things, as I've been trying to look at the Trump administration and apply some foresight and forecasting to what might happen next, is the fact that Trump is really, he's a winner, but
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily a leader, right?
Right.
And a winner for the short term is strategically not the best thing for the long term. We may be able to plant a flag or cut a trade deal or do something within the next 4 years or so, but if it costs us the next century of dominance by a foreign power, then it is not actually in the interest of the United States. It's in the interest of the Trump administration.
Right. I think Greenland is fascinating as a case study, like you said, for all the reasons that you just laid out, but also because we basically have an agreement with Denmark that we can use Greenland kind of however we'd like. It's not as, loose as that, but we had a 99% drawback, I think, in the last 30 years, if not less than that, of military apparatus and military personnel on Greenland. And we could just build that back up for national security. But the administration is actively taking this other version of this, which is really just messaging to the rest of the world and specifically our allies about where the Trump administration is at. Do you see that kind of a thing also being the messaging when it comes to, let's say, Venezuela and what we're doing there with the blockade and moving one out of every 4 naval ships into the Caribbean in a way that we have not seen since Teddy Roosevelt? I don't know.
I think it would be during the gunboat diplomacy times, which is a wild Wikipedia rabbit hole to get down. Yes. So I think that at no point in history is there a better time to say, look at what somebody does and not what they say. I think that what the current administration says internally is very, very different than how it acts externally. Look no further than the fact that we were presumably going into Venezuela to stop all of those narco terrorists. And then things pivoted. And then the oil companies all came to the White House for a public meeting. So on the face of things, clearly there is double talk, but this goes to, sort of age-old concept in geopolitical thinking, and they call it Putnam's two-level game. And Putnam's two-level game is this sort of game theory where you essentially have to sell a policy twice. You have to sell it to the American public, and you have to sell it to foreign powers. Now, both are sort of speaking with a different grammar here. So for the American public, the idea was, well, we have to stop drugs from coming into our country, and this is a national security issue. But from the foreign policy perspective, Maduro needed convincing, I suppose, to get into a helicopter so he could be flown away. And the Delta Force seemed to be very good at this.
Yeah, very convincing. Generally, they tend to be very convincing. Yeah.
They did a great job at that. But then the question is, again, the short-term thinking of this current administration is sometimes baffling. But the question is, what happens afterwards? And this is something that historically the United States has not been great at doing. It does a thing and then hand waving. And we've been in Afghanistan for 20 years or however long. Name a conflict and the end of it was American hand waving. The thing that I'm concerned about, which I don't see tons of indicators for right now, is that hand waving is now beginning in Venezuela. But what it appears has happened is the Trump administration has decapitated the regime, only to have a head grow back under the guidance of Delcy Rodriguez.
Right.
And it appears that she is going to be under the control of the United States. So we are literally seeing opposition leaders being taken by security services in Iran. So clearly, the problem wasn't the administration of Venezuela; it was the benefactors of their oil reserves. And the United States quite literally said in their actions, well, we want to be the benefactors, and we don't want you or China or Russia or even Iran to be the benefactors of either Venezuelan oil or Venezuelan strategic depth.
So do you think that there's a chance that in the list of options the president is given that some kind of forced regime change is possible in Iran?
I think Iran is a much different case than Venezuela. I think that one of the there's an enormous amount of difficulties in terms of forced regime change in Iran. Actually, they have been fairly coy about supporting one person or group of people over anybody else. If you look at all the way back to, Juan Guaido comes to mind in Venezuela, but the U.S. has always and never been shy about its opinion as to who should lead Venezuela. This is not really the case with Iran. It appears that the Israelis are really pushing for the son of the Shah to come back, and the U.S. has not really thrown any popular support. The messaging seems to be, hey, we think you guys should overthrow your government. But again, afterwards comes question mark and hand waving.
Right.
And there is a huge amount of difficulties which will come after a potential overthrow of the Islamic Republic. An enormous amount of difficulties. But what I don't think will happen is I don't think that we will see U.S. boots on the ground, Israeli boots on the ground, actually occupying Iran as a country. It is more or less impossible to do this, potentially for the fact that the geography alone is so non-permissive.
Right.
You've got, I think it's like 80 million people in Iran, enormous country, which is essentially an ocean of desert and mountains, which are not the best to fight in or occupy.
Right. Are you worried about the United States turning away from some of these broader, more diplomatic endeavors, whether it's with NATO, whether it's with Iran, whether it's with protecting Taiwan, by moving our fleet from the South China Sea into the Caribbean, that we are strategically abandoning positions that we've held for decades, and that will then lead into power vacuums. I've had lots of conversations with people about the end of USAID and what that means for certain parts of Africa and the incursion of China and sort of their Belt and Bridge, is that what it's called? Their program that was Belt and Road, but yes, and that being more of an influence in certain places that we are now strategically leaving. In Iran, I think specifically the fear is Russia, and Russia then giving a nuclear weapon of some kind to Iran to, threaten to escalate, certainly after we've decided not to renew this START treaty. So the non-nuclear proliferation treaty, are we doing these things and then creating a power vacuum that is going to be a mess that a different administration is going to have to clean up or won't be able to?
Well, it is an American tradition that every administration leaves in a mess for the next administration.
Yes.
And we should respect that. I think that the important thing to think about is to gauge how much of a mess is being left. And I think that, again, it kind of goes towards this short-term thinking versus long-term thinking thing. And that is the fact that over the last, year, we've seen a decided reduction in not only the alliance structures, but the aid apparatus and just other assets that the United States had in order to interact with the rest of the world. I think that people again, from the perspective of somebody in the United States, this may be sold to them politically in some way. Oh, Europe was a freeloader for all of these years. Oh, we shouldn't be, giving people free stuff because of USAID, X, Y, and Z. But I would encourage people to reframe this idea as a decided reduction in our toolbox for dealing with the rest of the world. That if we do not have this alliance structure, if we do not have USAID, if we don't have the ability to deal with the rest of the world in a non-directly transactional way where the dollars just have to make sense and the US has to be on top, then that is the only way we will be able to deal with the world. And then that is the only way that the world will deal with us right back. If you really want to, cut these bloodless deals between countries, well, then those countries can collaborate to do that right back to us. But if we want to build institutions over the long period, if we want to have decades-long diplomatic relations, which will eventually come back to help us in the long run, then we have to actually nurse those things, and we have to create the structure that allows them to thrive. And so tearing down these structures will harm us in the long term. And then in terms of, the stated point of view for removing USAID was to tackle the deficit. As far as I know, it was a part of the DOGE cuts.
Yeah, and there were some arguments that it was funding certain programs that don't align with the administration's policies, and then this very odd thing that was said mostly by people like Elon Musk that were weird. Funding USAID was also funding the CIA and black ops missions or off the books missions that he's implying that Americans shouldn't approve of, which I found interesting in a way to undercut the American intelligence community and military in a way that you don't normally hear American officials do.
I have a bone to pick with that sentiment, and part of the some of this comes from having been a Peace Corps volunteer, where we'll collaborate with USAID because it's like I worked trying to rebuild a basketball court in an Albanian village and to start a mobile library, and we got a couple $100 from USAID.
Sure. So real wet work stuff is what you're saying.
Yeah, real nefarious stuff. I actually spoke about that on a podcast, and one of the commenters was like, "Well, that's propaganda too." I'm like, dude, I'm just giving kids books to teach them how to read.
Right. And
and that's what we.
Yeah, I was gonna say, that is kind of what the point is from an American standpoint. That's kind of the reason you do that. Yes, it's propaganda, but also unless you're not supportive of any kind of propaganda at all, and then therefore we have to talk about ideas of argumentation and policy. But isn't that kind of what we want as Americans?
Well, what world do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a world where where soft power exists? Mm-hmm. Do you want to live in a world where you can deal internationally without putting a gun to somebody's head and saying you do this or I pull the trigger? Or in the case of the United States right now, it seems that through tariffs, we are putting a gun to the American taxpayer's head and saying to the rest of the world, you better do what I say or else I pull the trigger on the American taxpayer.
Right.
I'm going to make this guy pay so much money.
Yeah, if you don't buy this magazine, we'll kill this dog. Right? That's the
right.
Yeah.
So I think that the and I have to have some empathy for this position too, because I think that this is something that we forget a lot about due to how polarized the United States is. And while I was studying psychological operations and propaganda at the Rand School of Public Policy, I realized that how much of our division can be solved by trying to find some empathy for the other side, for the other point of view, and that does not mean embracing their political opinions, but it means that decisions are being made due to a certain kind of pain that person has uniquely experienced. And the only thing that is different about, reasonable people acting reasonably is who they are trusting to point to the source of that pain. I think that it is easy for me as somebody who, grew up in Los Angeles and has spent a lot of time living around the world to scratch my head at a lot of the sort of xenophobic political opinions that I see back in the States. But at the same time, I also see the media environment in the U.S., which is frankly shocking when I come back home. It is a good deal of messaging which essentially states that the rest of the world is deeply antagonistic to you as an American, and we need to strike the best deal we can to keep ourselves safe in a world that is that simply wants to destroy your livelihood. That's a powerful and terrifying message, one that is not based in reality, in my opinion, but it is both powerful and terrifying.
There's a group of people that I want to make sure that we do talk about here before I get into like my last set of questions here. It's the Kurds in the Middle East, and I know that you've done a lot of work with them, and I know that you've followed the plight of the Kurdish people and the Kurdish forces in the Middle East, and they're a really good case study about what it means to have the U.S. do what it's doing on an international scale right now. So walk me through what you've been seeing with the Kurds.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes as I look at foreign policy, there's this sort of like quadrant that you can think about where it's like a policy is good, feels good. A policy is bad, feels good. A policy is bad, or feels bad. And a lot of the things that we're seeing now are policies which are strategically good or strategically, they make sense for the larger strategy of the United States, but they feel horrible. If we're looking at the sort of plight of the Kurdish region from this realpolitik lens, which I think is the most sort of realistic way of looking at how power moves in the world, it tells a story about how the United States saw the Kurdish region as a fantastic ally of convenience for a momentary period of time. And for those that don't know, the Kurdish region is about 35 to 40 million people spread across the Middle East. It goes all the way over from the Zagros Mountains in northern Iran all the way to the Adriatic Sea. And presumably, the Kurds would be the fourth largest ethnicity, I think, in the Middle East. They are the fourth largest ethnicity, but it'd be an enormously powerful country if it was, a nation state that was sovereign to itself. However, due to the end of the treaties, or due to the end of World War I, the Treaty of Lausanne, they essentially were denied any sort of ability to be sovereign. But that didn't stop their galvanization as a people. So even though the Kurds are spread across southern Turkey, northern Syria, into Iraq, even up into Armenia, they still collaborate with one another and still work for communal defense. Now, this was really important to the United States during the rise of the Islamic State. Actually, even before that, the U.S. had worked to protect the Kurds from Saddam Hussein. This was during Operation Provide Comfort, where I believe it was one of the Bushes. I can't remember which now. It must have been George W. Bush. Check me on that. It was a Bush.
It was a Bush. It was a Bush. Yeah.
It must have been HW. But anyway, during that operation, essentially aid was dropped to the Kurdish region to make sure that they could essentially survive Saddam's attacks. But this didn't necessarily stop the Anfal campaign, which was a systematic eradication of the Kurds in northern Iraq. However, that harbored some good feelings between the Kurds and the United States and made them regional partners through the global war on terror. I know that the Kurdish region was one of the nicer places to work and collaborate for the American military. And then, of course, after the global war on terror came the rise of the Islamic State. And of course, you had an interoperable force with the Kurds, the Kurdish Peshmerga, who are the death facers, as they call them. And it seemed like a really fantastic idea to have the Kurds do a good deal of the heavy lifting in terms of fighting against the Islamic State. And there's some really important nuance to the fighting against the Islamic State that has both to do with the Kurds and also Iranian influence in Iraq. So the U.S. strategic imperative was to essentially put down the Islamic State as quickly as possible while limiting exposure to U.S. troops. So that meant that they would help support the Kurds as much as possible, give them weapons to fight on the U.S.'s behalf, but not so much that they would be able to arm themselves to create a sovereign nation in northern Iraq. Obviously, this would be remarkably destabilizing according to regional neighbors, none of whom want any sort of Kurdish sovereign state. Turkey believes that some of their groups are terrorist organizations. I've actually been banned from entering or traveling through Turkey due to the fact that I was accused of being a part of one of these organizations. So they are quite serious about it. And Istanbul is a lovely city. If you haven't written a book about the Kurds, you should go and check it out. But I am not allowed to go there anymore. So what this did was the Islamic State has been put down for the moment, though it seems like we might be seeing a sequel soon. And the Kurds use this moment where at least the Kurds in Iraq use this moment where the spotlight is on them to have a referendum on independence. They're going to vote themselves democratically to separate from Iraq and become their own independent nation. Now, I was actually on the ground in Iraqi Kurdistan during this referendum on independence, and I found it really interesting because you essentially have a conversation of two different tales of statecraft happening at the exact same time. One over to the west, we've got the Islamic State essentially enacting the oldest version of statecraft ever, which is we kill everybody until they agree we're on a map. And then on the other side, you've got the Kurds who are saying, well, everybody's going to vote and we're going to do this in a democratic way. At the end of the day, might made right, and the Iraqi military had the only vote that mattered. And so the Kurdish region of Iraq, I was actually there a couple months ago, still maintains its being a part of federal Iraq. So that is the sort of tale of how the Islamic State sort of informed the Kurds in Iraq. Now we have to go over to Syria, which is where we're seeing a good deal of action at the present moment. So the Kurds in Syria are largely across the northern border with Turkey. And the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the SDF, were the forces that were essentially working directly with the United States and allies to suppress the Islamic State in the area. So much so that they were also responsible for maintaining prisons that held Islamic State members and camps which held the families, both women and children, of Islamic State members. And as Syria transitioned away from Assad to the current government, al-Shara or Jalani, depending on which part of his resume we're talking about, essentially the United States and Syria needed to integrate these forces, the Kurdish-led SDF, into the armed forces of Syria. They were in talks to make this integration happen, and a couple of months ago, the talks fell through. The Syrian armed forces started to attack Kurdish neighborhoods in Aleppo, which is a city in northwestern Syria. And it became very clear that the Syrian armed forces were not actually serious about integrating the SDF, but in fact were going to start eliciting power over the whole of Syria. And this has meant that they are trying to push the Kurdish-led SDF out of the areas that they have traditionally held. And this has caused a cascade of difficulties in the region. One is the fact that the SDF has taken over the prisons and the camps that held members of the Islamic State and their family. We have reports that many of them have escaped. And it appears that the worst offenders, quote unquote, and this is coming from the U.S. government at the time, or the current U.S. government anyway, have been transferred by the U.S. military to prisons in Iraq. Is that the case? I don't know. I saw some buses. I saw some images of buses. It's possible. For my money, I don't love the idea that we created a moment in which Islamic State members could not only escape prisons, but are now transferred into a fairly weak judicial apparatus.
Right. And this would also be a moment in which the United States would generally, in the past, have stepped in between two, we can call them allies, quasi-allies, people that we have positive influence with and over. And we would have stepped in normally to be like, there needs to be a solution to this. And we just chose not to.
Yeah, the solution here was no solution. Actually, the solution was the short-term solution. So this is where I say that feels bad makes strategic sense, right?
Sure.
And I'm not trying to be glib here. I'm trying to be an analyst here. It's an absolute atrocity that is happening to the Kurdish region right now. The Kurdish region, the traditionally Kurdish city of Kobane, is under siege by the Syrian armed forces now. Statues are being destroyed. People are being terrorized, and they're even refusing humanitarian aid. I was actually speaking with some journalists who are trying to get into the region right now, and it appears that even journalists are being refused entry and stating that if you do come into this area, it's you're risking your life by being here.
It's never a great sign for what's happening over there. Yeah,
it's not ideal. And then the shocking thing to me, and one of the reasons that I've been trying to cover this as much as possible, is the fact that there really is no media coverage about this. We have not heard about any of this, and the reason is because it makes strategic sense for the current administration's goals in the Middle East. The current administration wants the Middle East to be a series of dependable and predictable partners. And this is a bad joke that the United States has done again and again in the Middle East, which basically says, hey, we are going to support autocrats and we'll know exactly what they're going to do because they will listen to us. And
whoops,
it always works. So that's why the Middle East is so peaceful. So we have chosen to throw our support behind al-Shara, who, if I oftentimes think that al-Shara's his terrorism LinkedIn profile is one of the most impressive. He's been to the Yale and Harvard of doing terrorism. And so now he throws on a suit and the United States says, well, he's a dependable actor. And because of this, we are not necessarily directly supporting the Syrian armed forces, but we're not denying them strategic depth, and we are looking the other way as they take over these previously held Kurdish regions. And this works, from the people that we want to work with in the Middle East. It also works from the point of view of Turkey, who's an enormously powerful, let's say, fair weather ally in the area, who wants their southern border free of any sort of possible Kurdish aggression. And so we are throwing our weight behind autocratic strongmen who we believe will be dependable partners in the future. And that's the story that I see from the ground. We are essentially saying to the Kurds, hey, thank you for your help previously.
Good luck.
Yeah. Right.
The last thing I want to move into here is It's related to something that happened, in the last 24 hours. At the U.S.-Mexico border in El Paso, we had the FAA all of a sudden put a ground stop on all these flights for what would have been 10 days. That ended up not being the case. And what happened there was the Department of Defense alleged there was some kind of cartel drone activity that was happening at the border. They wanted to test these brand new drones that they had that had not been cleared because we don't know what their impact would be on commercial aircraft yet. And this miscommunication or lack of communication, willfully or not, caused this disruption to happen. And it got me thinking, because it happened almost about the same time your first episode of the Under Report dropped, about open intelligence and open source intelligence. And that we learned all these things about what the DoD had been doing and didn't do because of open source reporting. We saw those things happen as well in Venezuela when you had all the videos start coming out at 3 a.m, 2 a.m, I guess for me. And then there are all these sorts of other lack of operational security things, namely the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, actively broadcasting, strike times and munitions of the Houthi rebels last year,
Right.
March of last year, in which he was found to have put troops in danger in doing so. I know this is a departure from what we were talking about, but how at risk are our operations, are our intelligence right now because we cannot get our hands around open source intelligence?
So
It's a big question, I know.
Yeah. So let's start with the drones here. I think that there's a similar thing going on between open source intelligence and the NOTAM that was issued only 24 48 hours ago in El Paso. And I think there's something similar going on here, and that is the fact that technology has advanced so rapidly across so many different mediums that it is near impossible to keep up with in terms of absolute security. So I don't remember exactly what the official narrative has become on that, but I thought it was something along the lines of, we've seen cartels, trafficking drugs using drones.
I mean, at first there was an active cartel using a drone, and we sent this thing out there to go knock it down. And then it was like, well, we've seen some, and then it's now become, we had reports that maybe someone saw something that looked like a cartel drone, and
Deeply
we had this new
satisfying
toy.
reporting.
Yeah, exactly. They're like, well, we got this new laser drone. Can we use it? And that's what happened.
Yeah, it seemed that this was also an opportunity for the U.S. to, which I don't know if this is going to be our move in the future, but it seems like it could be. It seems like it was an opportunity to say, but by the way, we were using a laser, and pretty cool, right? It's almost like the discombobulator weapon that a source leaked from Venezuela. Whatever, man. Cool. What are we doing here?
Well, exactly.
And so I think that this, one of the things that this tells us is how not prepared for this rapid advance in drone technology we are from a defensive point of view, but also from a just a logistics point of view.
Sure.
If we can have all of this confusion about what exactly happened and the fact that we have to shut down an airspace, if I am an adversary to the United States and I see that I can fly a $200 drone and over the border and shut down your airspace, well, man, I got $200.
Right.
Let's do it.
Right.
So I think that's one thing that is really telling about this experience. But really, the thing that we should think about again is like that cost imposition issue, right? The bar to entry for a potentially devastating attack or just something that throws a pretty cheap wrench in some pretty expensive machinery is really low. So in terms of open source intelligence, you used to need billions of dollars worth of satellite satellite time and networks of human intelligence operatives and assets on the ground and lasers and more lasers. You used to need all that stuff to find dynamic information that was coming in from foreign countries.
Mm-hmm.
Now you need an internet connection and a cell phone, and you need to know where to look. The Underreport is my newsletter and also my podcast, which talks about open source intelligence. And this is something that I was trained to do at one point. And I remember talking to a friend of mine in national security while I was writing some analysis. And I said to her, I think the only thing that separates me from anybody else is just like knowing which website to go to get the numbers from.
Right.
And she's like, yeah, that's all expertise really is. And
Mm-hmm.
and the fact that you have the ability right now to pay for moment-to-moment satellite imaging, the fact that anybody can look at Flight Radar 24 and find flights that are coming and going, and even filter for military.
Right.
The barrier to entry is so low now, and the only thing that it requires of you is the ability to learn these skills, right? And this could be learning how to fly a drone in the case of this experience in El Paso, or it could be the ability to create an AI deepfake, or the ability to track where an oil shipment is going. Yeah. National security cannot keep up with this level of transparency. There will always be operational risk now. Granted, previous to the internet and to essentially every smartphone being a sensor in a global network, there was always going to be operational risk, and OPSEC was never going to be perfect. But now it is so much harder to keep what you are doing in the shadows. Here's a good example and obviously there's good parts about this, and there are bad parts about it. One of the good parts is the fact that the United States is now, or I shouldn't say the United States, but everybody in the world is able to hold governments more accountable. We know when truly heinous things are happening. The genocide that was happening in South Sudan mm-hmm. was initially reported based off of satellite imagery from the Yale Humanitarian Center. Now, we simply would not have known that the Rapid Support Forces in South Sudan were executing villages of people if it wasn't for open source investigators keying in on that area of the world. And that's the good part of it. The bad part of it is the fact that windows go both ways. You can look into this sort of shadowy world of geopolitics, but it's going to look right back at you. And at the same time, governments can use this in order to create false information, deep fakes, and spread propaganda much more widely than it ever was before. Mm-hmm. There's a famous psychological operation that was performed in, I think it was the Czech Republic. It was called the Fake in the Lake, and essentially they were trying to make it seem as if the government in Czech Republic at the time, or I guess it would be Czechoslovakia at the time, was they were sympathetic to the Nazi cause at some point. So they wanted to basically plant all of these Nazi papers on officials, and they decided to create this steamer trunk and all these fake Nazi documents and throw it into a lake. And then they had to hire a documentary crew to come and pull this fake thing out of the lake, and then it had to be adjudicated by people to say, oh, these are real Nazi documents. Now think about all of the time and effort and expertise that went into essentially just getting a news story out there. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And now all you have to do is send a wacky tweet and it can catch fire.
Right. It does seem like with where we are with open source intelligence, with just how ready and at the fingertips it is for everybody, it's kind of made everything guerrilla warfare. If you can spend $200 to shut down a massive piece of American airspace, that's not very much. If you can send a tweet and send the State Department into a tailspin, that doesn't cost very much to do that. And it would seem like we're not quite ready for what this is going to be like as we look at the next decade, even though these things have been around for at least a decade.
Well, and this really sort of ends up coming down to what they call cognitive security, and this is something that I encourage everybody to look into. There's a wonderful podcast that's done by a guy named John Bicknell. It's called The Cognitive Crucible, and he talks about sort of anti-propaganda, anti-media bias. He talks to people who essentially are trying to sort of arm you with the tools to protect your brain from psychological manipulation, because that essentially is the front line now, and it has everything to do with the sort of double talk that the United States gets from its government and the output of its actions, right? So fifth generation warfare is where we are exiting the sort of kinetic space of the land, and we are going to fight in the gray matter of our opponents. And so the most valuable piece of real estate is behind your eyes and between your ears. And since it cannot be protected, especially in the United States, which at least for now really appreciates having freedom of speech and freedom of sharing ideas. That is a bit of our superpower. It is also, again, a double-edged sword. So ideas can come into our information space and we can be manipulated by bad actors. And so in order to make sure that we are sort of protected against what they call this fire hose of falsehoods, we have to arm ourselves and put our own raincoats on. And that's by diversifying our information streams. And it's by making sure that we are looking at the facts on the ground as facts on the ground rather than political spin. And this is one of the reasons that I think that open source intelligence is so important for everybody to learn and for everybody to have some understanding of, if it's even just a basic sense of it, is because that allows you to look at stories and look at things that have happened in the news without political spin. And by doing that, you become a lot more resilient to being manipulated by whatever the point of view of, your favorite newscaster is.
Yeah.
And I think that's it's a difficult skill to learn, but at the same time, I feel a lot better. Like, it's a lot, like I live overseas for the most part. And when I come back to the States, I find myself just sort of saturated by sort of political antagonism. And I'll listen to a news story for 20 minutes or so and realize that I didn't actually walk away with any facts, but I do feel bad.
Sure. Yeah, I feel mad or I feel bad or like I feel despondent or whatever. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and there is, there's I made a short video about this. There's this idea of terror management theory, and terror management theory is this concept that when you have something that's sort of mentally antagonistic to you, and it has risen above what you perceive your agency or understanding are, then essentially you freeze and you are unable to take any meaningful action. And I'm sure that your listeners will have an understanding of this sort of feeling of powerlessness or cynicism that comes from that lack of meaning and that lack of agency.
Yeah.
And what I feel open source intelligence work does is it gives you back that agency and it gives you back the tools that allow you to discern meaning from whatever you've just seen. Yeah. Otherwise, the world is really just sort of a blur of people who mean you harm and those that are willing to protect you. And then somehow it seems like a bit of a shadow puppet show. Being managed by one person,
Yeah, and somewhere you fit in the middle, which is the whole idea of the show you're on right now, Make It Make Sense, is to cut through some of that and to try to give people a little bit of a better scaled down sense of that. And I really could not think of a better guest to have on the show than you today. So thank you, Eric, so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Yeah, and I'm also a fan. So this is great.
I want to thank Eric again for being on the show. You can find a link to the Under Report, both the podcast and the newsletter, as well as his book, You Are Not Here, in the show notes for this episode. And that's it for today's episode. Please rate and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. Like and subscribe if you're a watcher on YouTube. Sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack to get access to that brand new newsletter on Sunday, Make It Make Nonsense. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word, on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on Twitter and Blue Sky, and at Grant_Herms on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you next week.